I can tell how excited all of you are to get into this amazing lineup of speakers we have today. To kick us off, I'd like to invite on-screen Professor Jeffery Long to speak about his research on Hinduphobia and the working definition of Hinduphobia as it developed through this initiative. Prior to the conference, scholar speakers deliberated and created a working definition of Hinduphobia. This working definition provides a helpful framework to understand the myriad of ways in which Hinduphobia is actualized. Jeffery D. Long is the Carl W. Ziegler Professor of Religion and Philosophy at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania, where he has taught since receiving his doctoral degree from the University of Chicago Divinity School in the year 2000. In the year 2021, Elizabethtown College has given Dr. Long its Rank Award for Research Excellence. In 2018, he received the Hindu American Foundation's Dharma Seva Award for his ongoing work to promote accurate and culturally sensitive portrayals of Indic traditions in the American education system and popular media. He has spoken in such prestigious venues such as the University of Chicago, Yale University, Princeton University, as well as the United Nations. He is the author of A Vision for Hinduism, Jainism, and Introduction, the Historical Dictionary of Hinduism, the first and second editions, and Hinduism in America, A Convergence of Worlds. He is an initiated member of the Vedanta Society established by Swami Vivekananda in 1894 and is an active member in the Hindu community in America. During Jeffrey G's talk, please feel free to type in questions that you would like us to answer during the Q&A following this presentation. Remember our ground rules and make sure your questions are relevant to the topic being discussed. Please welcome Professor Jeffery Long.
Namaste, namaskar, and good morning and good evening or whatever time it is to all of you around the world who are tuning in. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I just want to say how honored and grateful I am to be part of this program. The Hindu community has given me really more than I could ever possibly repay in love and acceptance and support. And if I can be of any help at all on this issue of Hinduphobia, I want to contribute whatever I can. So I'm going to share my screen now. And so hopefully everyone can see this presentation that I've put up. So yes, you can see it. Excellent. Okay. So Hinduphobia, its definition, structure, and history. So we begin with the definition of Hinduphobia that was just mentioned. This definition was compiled by several scholars who were involved in the organization of the conference. So this is not something I can claim as my own. It's just my job to present it to everyone here. I'll provide a little bit of commentary on it as I read through it, and then I'm going to follow that with some further reflections. So the working definition of Hinduphobia. Hinduphobia is a set of antagonistic, destructive, and derogatory attitudes and behaviors towards Sanatana Dharma, popularly known as Hinduism, and Hindus that may manifest as prejudice, fear, or hatred. Hinduphobic rhetoric suggests the entirety of Sanatana Dharma, reduces the entirety of Sanatana Dharma to a rigid, oppressive, and regressive tradition. Pro-social and reflexive aspects of Hindu traditions are ignored or attributed to outside non-Hindu influences. This discourse actively erases and denies the persecution of Hindus, while disproportionately painting Hindus as violent. These stereotypes are used to justify the dissolution, external reformation, and demonization of the range of indigenous Indic knowledge traditions known as Sanatana Dharma. The complete range of Hinduphobic acts extends from microaggressions to genocide. So there's a very wide range of behaviors that are encompassed by this term Hinduphobia. So we're talking about things ranging from, say, bullying on the individual level to genocide. Hinduphobic projects include the destruction and desecration of Hindu sacred spaces, aggressive and forced proselytization of Hindu populations, targeted violence towards Hindu people, community institutions and organizations, and ethnic cleansing and genocide. Some examples of Hinduphobia: calling for, abetting, or normalizing the killing or harming of Hindus as a result of an extremist and illiberal view of religion and history, kidnapping Hindu women and children in acts of forcible marriage and religious conversion, outright denying or accusing Hindus or any people of inventing or exaggerating the persecution of Hindus, including genocide, calling for the destruction and dissolution of Hinduism on the basis of its allegedly inherent irredeemability. Just a quick comment about this last one. We see this when maybe some practice, some aspect of Hindu history or tradition is seen in a negative light. It is basically proposed that this characterizes the entirety of the tradition, and that the only way to do away with some particular social evil would be to do away with Hinduism altogether, accusing those who speak about the persecution of Hindus or Hinduphobia of being agents of violent political agendas, and include names like Hindutva, BJP, IT cell, Hindu nationalist, Hindutva virus, etc. So we're all here today speaking about this. So be prepared. We might actually, some of us, get these names thrown at us. Maintaining that all inequity in Indian society, including but not limited to sati, caste, misogyny, communal violence, and destruction of places of worship, stem from and are inextricably bound up with Hinduism. Again, quick comment on this one. It's not to deny that there are inequities in Indian society and that all of these things listed don't occur and are not profoundly problematic. It's the equation of these things with Hinduism, that Hinduism necessarily involves these things, that is problematic. Using or enacting symbols and actions that evoke historical attacks on Hindu society, iconoclasm, killing cows, conversion, in contemporary discourse to intimidate Hindu people. Making unsubstantiated claims about the political agendas of people who are simply practicing Hinduism. Personal note, I've experienced this one myself. Stating that the Manusmriti is a normative text for all Hindus and exaggerating its role in historical and contemporary Hindu life. Claiming that Hinduism or Sanatana Dharma does not exist as a valid, cohesive category of spiritual traditions. I've seen this particular claim used to silence people who want to speak from Hindu perspectives. Conflating diasporic Hindu identity with Indian citizenship, ethnicity, and patriotism. Erasure of colonization, including but not limited to calling Hindus the white people of South Asia. Before I go into some further reflections, because this document is still in the process of being crafted, and in fact, I think one of the purposes of this conference is to get feedback that could help toward it. One word I think I would want to add to that list is bullying. Intimidation was mentioned. In particular, one thing I'm personally aware of is bullying that Hindu children face in the United States very often, that's specifically connected to Hinduism or to what they may be learning about Hinduism in their classes. So this also needs to be, I think, incorporated. So moving on from the definition, now I'm going to get into just my own personal reflections on Hinduphobia. I'm going to talk about the following topics in my time. What should it be called? Hinduphobia and other phobias or prejudices. Distinguishing Hinduphobia from legitimate criticism. The historical roots of Hinduphobia in religious bigotry and racism. I'm actually not going to, I think, have time to go into this fully, but I understand other speakers are going to delve into these very deeply today. And then finally, just some thoughts on how to respond to Hinduphobia. So is Hinduphobia the correct term? Some have criticized this term and suggested alternatives such as anti-Hinduism, Hindu dvesha, that is hatred of Hinduism, of Hindus and Hinduism, and so on. The terminology is less important, in my opinion, than the ability to identify and respond to the phenomenon. So to some extent, I think debates about whether the word Hinduphobia is the right word or not may not be entirely productive. I would want to make a case for the term Hinduphobia. However, I also want to say that, again, I don't think the term itself is as important as understanding the phenomenon and coping and dealing with the phenomenon. Why do I use the term Hinduphobia? Blank phobia, right? Phobia of whatever, is already a very familiar usage in our society. I think it's becoming more familiar all the time for describing similar forms of prejudice. Islamophobia, xenophobia, homophobia. There are important exceptions. Hatred and prejudice against Jewish people is called anti-Semitism. Hatred and prejudice against Catholics and the Catholic Church is called anti-Catholicism. So, we don't necessarily have to call it Hinduphobia, but this is kind of becoming a standard way of speaking about some kind of deep-seated, irrational prejudice against a group of people and a belief system and way of life. In response to the very valid point that some critics of the term Hinduphobia have made, that the word phobia denotes a fear, whereas Hinduphobia seems more like a form of hatred, I would argue that fear, and ultimately even underlying fear, ignorance, underlies all forms of hatred. And any of you who might know anything about my work might know that I'm a Star Wars fan. What does Yoda say? Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to another pop culture icon that I'm a fan of. This is Neil Peart from the band Rush, from the song Witch Hunt. Ignorance and prejudice and fear walk hand in hand. Lest you think I'm being too lighthearted when talking about such a serious topic and invoking pop culture figures, I'll quote from Swami Vivekananda. Fear comes from the selfish idea of cutting oneself off from the universe. The smaller and the more selfish I make myself, the more is my fear. If a man thinks he is a little nothing, fear will surely come upon him. And the less you think of yourself as an insignificant person, the less fear there will be for you. We have to remember that all of these people who express hatred, behind that hatred, there is some kind of fear. And ultimately, this fear is rooted in ignorance and the idea that I am a separate self cut off from the rest of existence. And then we try to fill that void with some kind of sense of identity that we then have clash against other people's identities. And this is where Hinduphobia, and I think all the phobias ultimately come from. What about other phobias and prejudices? Speaking out against Hinduphobia does not imply that one cares only about prejudice or violence against Sanatana Dharma or Hinduism and Hindus. I can imagine one response that some of us might get after this conference is someone saying, well, what about all the other people who are suffering in the world? Well, yes, speaking out against Hinduphobia is of a piece with speaking out against all forms of prejudice and all violence against others on the basis of their identity. We're drawing attention to this one because most of us here either are Hindus or are close to the Hindu community or allies of the Hindu community. And so we want to draw attention to this. This is important. That's not saying the others aren't important. They're all important. One who is opposed to other forms of prejudice will, if intellectually consistent, be opposed to Hinduphobia as well. And I think this is a very important thing to say. There are some people who sound Hinduphobic, who are often very vocal against other forms of prejudice. And that's a glaring inconsistency. Everyone needs to feel welcome, accepted, safe, and so on. An opponent of Hinduphobia will also be opposed to all forms of prejudice. If we're intellectually consistent, if someone says to us, well, what about this problem? What about that problem? Say, yes, of course, absolutely. What did Swami Vivekananda? I quote him a lot. I'm part of his tradition. Sectarianism, bigotry, and its horrible descendant fanaticism have long possessed this beautiful earth. They filled the earth with violence, drenched it often and often with human blood, destroyed civilization, and sent whole nations to despair. Had it not been for these horrible demons, human society would be far more advanced than it is now. So to speak out against Hinduphobia is part of the whole project of speaking out against all forms of sectarianism, bigotry, and fanaticism, is part of the project of seeing that human progress actually goes in the direction that it potentially can and does not continue to spiral into violence and mutual destruction. Distinguishing Hinduphobia from legitimate criticism. This is also a response to a criticism we might receive when we point out Hinduphobia. To stand against Hinduphobia is not to say that Hindus can do no wrong. I think from what I know of the Hindu community that I know and love, Hindus are usually the most critical of Hindus in practice, right? Not of Hinduism necessarily, not of the tradition or its ideals, but of other Hindus. You know, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. There's a rich history of internal critique and reform within Hindu traditions, and also among Hindus, Buddhists, and Jains, sustains that extends back thousands of years. There was no holding back. If you read the old Sanskrit literature, the Darshana literature, the ancient Indian philosophers really relentlessly went after one another's arguments, things they disagreed with in the other side, and this is a vigorous tradition in India. So reflexively accusing all critics of being Hinduphobic is definitely counterproductive. Someone might be just expressing their genuine point of view about something. Hinduphobic criticism, however, aims to tear down Hinduism, whereas what I would call legitimate criticism is aimed at constructive change. So just to take an example, it's a controversial one, and I always worry about using examples because the conversations get sidetracked into the example and not into the main point. But a big sort of looming issue, I think, in the minds of many is casteism, right? The prejudice against people based on their jati, based on birth. And there's some criticism of that which is aimed at basically eliminating prejudice. And again, I would say, who could disagree with that? At the same time, you sometimes see this criticism couched in the terms of this prejudice being inherent or essential to Hinduism, which means that the only way to get rid of the prejudice would be to get rid of Hinduism. So you're definitely talking about Hinduphobia there. So there's a test, I think, if one encounters a criticism of Hindus or Hinduism that can help you differentiate whether you're encountering Hinduphobia or whether you're encountering legitimate criticism. If a criticism of Hindus or Hinduism is offered, is there any hypothetical situation in which Hindus might do something short of renouncing Hinduism, ceasing to be Hindu, that would satisfy the critic? That is, someone offers a criticism of Hinduism, and you as a Hindu say, well, what if we did this, right? What if we changed that thing that you are criticizing? If so, right, if one can offer such a scenario, and the critic says, yes, that would be great, then you have a case of legitimate criticism. If not, then this is a case of Hinduphobia. Again, to go back to the caste example, let's say you're Hindu and you have a friend who says, I've learned a little about Hinduism and I don't like this caste prejudice that I've learned about. There are people who are treated very horribly. I don't agree with that. Now, suppose your reply to that is, I don't agree with that either. And in fact, I don't think that reflects the highest values of Sanatana Dharma. When I read the Bhagavad Gita, when I hear and study the teachings of Hindu sages, I don't see support for any of that kind of bias. I see an injunction that we should see the divine in everyone and treat all beings with respect. So if your friend then says, oh, wonderful, that's good. So Hinduism is more complex than I thought. It's not just all prejudice. There's this whole other side that I was not aware of. Thank you. Right? So that person was offering a legitimate criticism. They were concerned about these things they'd heard about prejudice. If you say what I just described, and the person says, oh, you bloody Hindutva nationalists, something like that, then they weren't really sincere, right? They were really just expressing their dislike for the whole tradition. So again, to stand against Hinduphobia is not to say that Hindus can do no wrong, but according to Hinduphobic discourse, Hindus and Hinduism are always by definition wrong. In fact, that's basically my personal definition of Hinduphobia, is a discourse in which whatever problem you're talking about, it's basically the fault of Hindus or Hinduism. And if that sounds exaggerated or like a straw man, I've encountered this. I've personally argued with people who took that position. And so it's there, it's out there. Hinduphobia, in terms of its historical roots, I would say has two sources. In fact, this is one of the reasons it's a particularly, I would say, virulent type of phobia. Hinduphobia is a potent blend of religious bigotry and racism. Either of those can lead to prejudice and persecution. If you combine them, then you really do have an uphill battle against something that can be very deeply rooted and deeply irrational in the people that you encounter. On the religious side, it rises from fear or hatred of Hindu ideas and practices. So here you would get, for example, And of course, this is not a reflection at all on all of Christianity, right? That would be a Christianophobic statement. But there are those Christians or those substreams of Christianity that say that Hinduism is demonic, that the Hindu deities are demonic, that we worship Satan and things like that, and therefore deeply opposed to anything Hindu. And so that is coming from a religious anxiety. One could more broadly define this as an ideological bigotry because there are also non-religious or secular expressions of it as well. Just as there may be people who believe that Hindus are going to hell and Hinduism is demonic because of their religious belief, there are also non-religious people who see Hinduism as, again, inherently unjust, inherently violent, and so forth. So it's you could say not just religious bigotry, but generally an ideological stance that if we're talking about Hinduism, we're talking about something deeply problematic and flawed. Because the vast majority of Hindus are of Indian descent, at least 91% of Hindus in America are of Asian Indian descent. And globally, 93% or more of Hindus actually live in India. So there's a tendency to frequently identify and conflate being Hindu with being Indian. That's not correct, of course. There are, of course, a lot of Indians who are not Hindu, and there's a few of us Hindus who are not Indian, but who are adopters of the tradition, who have taken up a Hindu path. But vast majority of Hindus are of Indian descent. So because of that, you have a type of Hinduphobia that is really basically racism. And this could be seen as a variant of a broader Indophobia. There's another term, another phobia, just fear and dislike, racism against people of Indian origin. This frequently does not differentiate between Hindus, Sikhs, or Muslims. And in fact, there have been a number of cases throughout history, going back to the early 20th century, where Sikhs, for example, were attacked by bigots in the US who were calling them Hindus, because they didn't really know the difference, and frankly, they didn't care. This is something about bigotry, right? It's not a rational, informed position. It's a hatred. It's a visceral thing, and it does not differentiate, right? It's the people are not using their higher faculties when they succumb to bigotry. So it's basically based on what you look like, and so this kind of Hinduphobia is there too, which, to my way of thinking, people may disagree, but it suggests a sort of natural alliance that ought to occur, I think, at least in the US, amongst the various groups who are of Indian descent who practice various religions, because everyone's getting attacked, right, in the same way. How do we respond to Hinduphobia? The expressions of Hinduphobia are so varied, ranging from the micro level, microaggressions, something interpersonal, all the way up to the level of genocide, mass murder on the national and international level, to, of course, everything in between. That responses to Hinduphobia must be similarly varied. So there's not going to be one size fits all response to Hinduphobia, and I'm not going to claim to offer one. I mean, of course, the ultimate solution is, we all become enlightened and get moksha, but short of that, there are many different types of responses, because every situation is going to be different. Every context is going to be different. Responses can range from one-to-one engagement between persons. Let's say you experience some coldness or some aggression from some individual, maybe in the workplace, maybe in school or something. And maybe it's a situation where you can approach that person and say, do you have a problem with me? Is everything okay? What's going on? And I've heard of experiences, I know of experiences where people make that initiative and a beautiful friendship evolves where there was bigotry before. Someone just has deep misunderstandings about India or Hinduism that they project onto you, and once they meet you and find out you're a great person, it changes everything. That's the personal level. Community action. This is some of what I've been involved in off and on through the years, where you have groups within our local community and also more broadly speaking across the country to address these kinds of issues as they arise. Legal action, of course, is there. And then you have national or even international action. When we're talking about genocide, we're talking at the level of military intervention or getting the United Nations involved in various ways to try to stop this kind of thing from happening. So the responses are greatly varied. I'm now just going to conclude with a few general observations that I think we could apply to a lot of these situations. And I'm thinking here, I'm not really now thinking so much of things like genocide. I'm not thinking, and I'm really not thinking about Indian politics. I'm thinking about mainly my context here in the United States and what Hindus experience in America. First thing, of course, is getting to the roots of Hinduphobia. Hatred, again, is based on fear, and fear is based on ignorance, right? Avidya, as we say in Hindu tradition. People in general fear what they do not understand, so that's the wider public, and ideological leaders, religious and otherwise, may fear the inherent persuasiveness and power of Hindu ideals. And this is not something I hear very much in the discourse, either among Hindus or non-Hindus, but if you look over the history of the influence of Hindu thought in America, some of the most brilliant minds have been attracted to this tradition, going back to the 18th and 19th centuries. John Adams, the second president of the United States, was fascinated by Hinduism. Very famously, of course, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Walt Whitman. Then you get into the 20th century, Christopher Isherwood, Aldous Huxley, J.D. Salinger, Houston Smith, Joseph Campbell. Brilliant minds who saw that there is an inherent appeal. One of the things that attracts many people like myself to Hinduism is that we have these sort of two dominant views in the Western world. You have kind of let's say, a more evangelical kind of Christian perspective on reality, and then you have more kind of an atheistic, materialistic perspective on reality. And many of us find neither of those particularly satisfying. Where do you find a rational and yet spiritually fulfilling approach to existence? I have found it in Vedanta, and I think this is very powerful. And there are historical cases of people who have felt threatened by this. In Swami Vivekananda's time, there were people who really felt the need to discredit him because he was tremendously popular. When Paramahansa Yogananda came into the U.S. In 1920 and stayed right until his passing in the 50s, there was a lot of opposition to him because what he was teaching was extremely attractive. So people feel that, we're gonna lose our congregation, right? We're gonna lose our customers. So I think that is really at the root of a lot of this kind of phobia. It's therefore essential in terms of the wider public to communicate an accurate, properly nuanced understanding of Hindu thought and practice to the wider public through the educational system and media. And we need more Hindus in Hindu studies. I know it's great to, make money and, go into, medicine and IT and so on. And that's fantastic. But if the Hindu community surrenders the project of creating the narrative of Hinduism to people outside, right, outsources it, then the danger is going to be there that what is presented, even if it's not Hindu-phobic, it may not resonate or connect with how practicing Hindus experience lived Hinduism. And that voice needs to be there. I'm not saying you have to be Hindu to be in Hindu studies. Far from it. I mean, anyone can study something and learn it well and master it and present it in an empathetic way. But to be sure, then you really need people who are practicing and serious and who can bring that perspective and engage with, the critical theory and so on that's there. Otherwise, it becomes very, very difficult to engage with these kinds of things. I would say getting our own house in order as well is part of the project of responding to Hinduphobia. And there are two parts to this. Part one is social media and communication. I just want to preface this by saying social media, in my experience, brings out the worst in everybody. My social media footprint is relatively light. I think I have a handful of Twitter followers. I think I post on Twitter once every 3 months or so. More active on Facebook, but I'm mostly presenting, personal announcements there. I just read horrible things on social media by everybody. I do not think that Hindus are the worst offenders by any stretch of the imagination here. However, even, and in fact, I would say indeed especially, when Hindu-phobic attacks are the most emotionally provocative, personal attacks, threats of violence, and so on, these are not only adharmic, but they're counterproductive. right? Someone accuses a community of being violent and people get angry and respond by threatening violence. Well, you've just kind of proven the point of the person who's attacking you. Taking the high road does not mean doing nothing, right? I'm not saying, oh, just be nice and don't speak back, but it means responding with facts and with dignity, right? You are a representative of Sanatana Dharma in your life, and especially in the United States, where most people are not even really aware of this tradition. And so that's a special responsibility. Also differentiating between Hinduphobia and constructive criticism. These nuances get really lost in social media because you're not seeing the person face to face and hearing their tone of voice. And so, sometimes people communicate in ways that are very unfortunate on social media. And even though, responding in a good way doesn't mean doing nothing, there is a time on social media when we need to know when not to feed the trolls. I think sometimes there are people who are deliberately provocative and they want the kind of angry response that they get. I just ignore those people. I mean, they're there for their own ego. And in fact, I think the block function on sites like Facebook and Twitter, it's a wonderful thing. You have a very peaceful life if you just aren't filling your mind with the nonsense that people are putting out there. Part 2, getting our own house in order, living up to our own ideals. And I think most Hindus do this, but if we work for the internal reform of Hinduism in practice, where we do see problems, when we aim to conform to the highest ideals of Sanatana Dharma, this is the inherently right thing to do, but it also blunts the ability of Hinduphobes to criticize Hindus. If Hinduphobes are saying, oh, Hindus are like this, Hindus are like that, and the wider public is saying, well, all the Hindus I know are great people, then that criticism falls flat. So let's all be great people, right? That's what we need to do. And I think most do already, right? This isn't the whole problem, but it's just one thing we can do. Finally, finding allies. There are plenty of right-thinking people who can recognize that Hinduphobia is as harmful to all of humanity as any other prejudice. I believe many of those allies are speaking in the conference today. Opponents of all forms of prejudice need to unite, pointing out and critiquing prejudice against others wherever it occurs, and uprooting it from within not only our own communities, but our own consciousness as well. I'm not talking about going around scolding each other. I'm talking about everybody, Hindu and non-Hindu alike. We all need to look within ourselves and say, where are my blind spots? Where am I not seeing the divinity and the inherent dignity of all living beings that Sanatana Dharma teaches, and changing our own lives accordingly. Finally, we have to have the courage of our convictions. And I'm saying, especially to the college students, don't be intimidated. Be proud of your Dharma. And to paraphrase Swami Vivekananda, stop not until the goal, that is the goal of a world free from sectarianism, bigotry, and fanaticism, is reached. And that is the end of my formal comments. I've tried to leave some time for questions and discussion. I unfortunately do have to leave the conference about 10 a.m. Because of my teaching schedule, but I'm very, very grateful to have had the opportunity to speak with all of you. So thank you very much, and hand it over now, I think, to the organizers to maybe moderate the discussion.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction to that framework for understanding Hinduphobia, Professor Long. Now, our audience has sent in some amazing questions, and as MC, I'll be asking those questions on behalf of the audience members that have submitted them. So one of the questions is, how is Hinduphobia similar to other anti-religious bigotries, and how is it different? And why do you think people are so resistant to accepting the idea that Hinduphobia is legitimate? Is that a form of Hinduphobia itself? Is the denial of Hinduphobia a form of Hinduphobia?
Excellent questions. I'll answer the second one first because it's easy. Yes, the denial of Hinduphobia, I think, is an expression of Hinduphobia. It's what they call gaslighting. I mean, I've experienced Hinduphobia, and I didn't even grow up Hindu, right? I'm this white guy from Missouri, but I've been told I'm going to hell. I've been told I'm a bad influence on young people and things like that. When I became chair of my department at the college where I teach, now this ended up going very, very well, but it's a church-affiliated college, and there were actually people from the church who were concerned that someone who professed Hinduism was becoming the department chair of religious studies. So I had to meet them, and They actually were all very nice. I mean, the minute they found out I believed in God, they were fine. I mean, that was really all they wanted to know. But, I talked to them about rebirth. I talked to them about Sri Ramakrishna and, all of these things, and they were fine. But there's that worry. And I kind of move into the first question as well. So yes, I mean, the denial of Hinduphobia, I think, is a form of Hinduphobia. If you've experienced it and someone is dismissing your experience, that's abusive, actually. So I would just dismiss such claims. Do some people get maybe over enthusiastic about what they think is Hinduphobia? They say, oh, so and so's Hinduphobic, and maybe they're not really. Yeah, that happens. But just to deny the whole phenomenon is crazy. How is Hinduphobia like and not like other religious phobias? I think one of the things that I think it's more like other anti-religious phobias than not like, because in the case of most religious phobias, the phobia stems from ultimately just religious disagreement. Someone just does not agree with a particular worldview. They think it's wrong, and they think people should think correctly, so they're against that perspective. But then for that to turn into a phobia, there has to be this additional kind of hateful, non-rational element that gets introduced. That's where I think the racism comes in. That's not unique to Hinduphobia. There are a lot of Islamophobia in the U.S. is also racially connected. Basically, brown people are sort of all conflated together, and you have this kind of phobia. The Jewish community has been, you could say, sort of racialized in a way. Anti-Semitism is a very, very complex type of phobia and hatred, where you have what would initially seem to be a religious disagreement. But in Nazi Germany, for example, if a Jewish person would convert to another religion, that would not be sufficient to save their lives. So it was seen as somehow genetic. So Hinduphobia is a little like that. In my opinion, Hinduphobia is most akin to anti-Semitism of all the various phobias, because I think it may also be fueled in the U.S. By the fact that Hindus are a relatively successful community, or at least are perceived as such, but I think really are successful. And the Jewish community is perceived and actually often is the same. So you get resentment. So we have to add a third element. You have religious disagreement, racism, and a kind of class resentment going on. And that's very powerful. I mean, that's, if someone wants a scapegoat, those are the ingredients.
Thank you for explaining that. There's an amazing question in the Q&A section by Bhavnesh Prabhakar. And he asks, how can we emphasize the day-to-day Hindu phobia that people face? Because from his experience, most Hinduphobia deniers believe that the problem is purely academic.
Right. No, and I think this requires people who experience it. I mean, unfortunately, so often the burden is on the victim to talk about it, right? To expose it. And in fact, this is something maybe Hindu Students Council would be really good at. And maybe you already do this, but sessions where people talk about, maybe on a fairly regular basis, okay, what did you experience today, this week, this month, and support each other. And by talking about it, people become more aware of it. And there are all kinds of prejudices that and sensitivities that people have had through the years that people often just weren't aware of. And then once people start talking about it, then yes, it becomes a real thing. A lot of this is happening, I think, in this very rarefied atmosphere of politics and academia, and people think that's all that's going on. But no, it's not. It's about what Hindus experience every day. And I have so many friends, and again, it's that mix of racism. They've had experiences like in corporate boardrooms or in faculty discussion meetings. They'll express an idea, and people just kind of frown and don't say anything and pass on. And then a white person says the same thing, and everyone goes, "Brilliant idea! Oh, great!" That's a form of that's some kind of prejudice going on, right? So these are the kinds of day-to-day experiences that in the aggregate make us realize there's a wider phenomenon and problem here.
And there's another amazing question that says, how can Hindus and their allies work with Muslim people and their allies? And that's a very powerful question.
It is. It's a great question, because that's a very hard nut to crack, because these two communities in particular, I mean, there's just been an awful lot of damage done to one another especially, I mean, in the living memory, right, in the last century, partition. There are people still carrying both physical and mental wounds from those experiences. So that is very, very, very hard, but it is possible. And I know of other situations, for example, where Israelis and Palestinians, for example, have managed to. There's this very famous kind of summer camp. I don't know much about it. I'm out on a limb here, but where you get young people from the two communities to just get to know each other and work together, and get to know each other not as members of that identity or community, but just as people, and that a lot can be done. I think interfaith friendships and personal connections and community organizations that can foster those. I mean, I think this is something that is really going to be best solved at the micro level, not by some great proclamation from, Narendra Modi and the Prime Minister of Imran Khan from, they get together and proclaim something. I don't think that's going to do very much. It might do a little bit, but it's ordinary people getting together and overcoming those barriers and realizing that all the demonization and all the horrible things they've heard about the other community they're just either untrue or they're only true of a particular segment of people, not the whole community.
Thank you so much once again, Jeffrey G, for being part of this groundbreaking event. And thank you for making this possible.
For the latest on our YouTube channel, click subscribe and hit the bell icon for alerts on new content. Remember to like, comment, and share our videos. For more about HSC, you can visit the social media handles listed below.